Welcome, everybody. My name is Frank Moley, and I'm going to talk to you today about why continuous delivery, honestly, is boring, and how we at DataStax almost can now ignore it thanks to our integration with Harness and some good old planning. A little bit about who I am. So I'm a cloud-native engineer, architect, and manager. I've been part of the team that is responsible for building Azure.datastax.com, as well as the entire cloud platform for DataStax as a whole. I'm also a LinkedIn Learning content author and instructor on many topics, including architecture, microservices, security, Go, Python, Java, and a majority of my work is around the Spring framework for Java. Most of my focus in my career, and especially here at DataStax, has been focused on back-end service development, infrastructure, and CI/CD, and obviously the CI/CD is what brings me here today. So I want to start off by talking about the problem statement that started our relationship between DataStax and Harness that got us here today. So as you should with any good CI/CD platform, deployment to prod constantly was the first and foremost requirement. Any tooling that we use had to be capable of deploying to prod hundreds of times a day. And we as a team had to be able to support that deployment without any interaction. And I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. Now, we deploy a multitude of applications, and each of those applications is microservices based, which means that by its very nature, we're deploying a multitude of services. So now you have a multitude of services and a multitude of applications that you're deploying to prod constantly. During our peak implementation, when we were really building out Astra, we were deploying hundreds and hundreds of times a day, which is exactly what you want out of a CI/CD pipeline. But there's some caveats that came along with that. Now, zero downtime of our pipelines is critical. Not only were we supporting our team and the development efforts that we were doing to bring Astra to market, but as I alluded to, we also managed the platform for DataStax Cloud, which means that we were also managing the pipelines for other teams that weren't specifically on Astra or were tangential to Astra. And as such, we couldn't have any downtime because that would not only impact us, but it could potentially impact them. We also had to have zero downtime of our applications. Now, that should be kind of a no-brainer in today's day and age where you're deploying to prod constantly, your app should just work. But there were some times where we would actually break application deployments with our previous solution that would actually render the application to be unusable. Another piece of the puzzle that we had to deal with was we had new applications being developed, and we still do today. As you might imagine, with any growth company, you're constantly building and rolling out new applications and new ideas. And as such, we had to onboard those applications and those teams with little to no interaction. And the reason we had to have little or no interaction, and what goes back to some of our problems before, is we're actually a relatively small team. The backend support team that handles all of the infrastructure and all of the core services for Astra also supports the CI/CD pipeline, our OAuth system, and other operational burdens. So as such, this very small team has limited bandwidth, especially when dealing with something that should be as fundamental as CI/CD. So now you're into the conundrum that we were dealing with when you look at some of the other tooling on the market and the fact that it required a lot of our integration. And we're going to talk quite a bit about that and how we got into the Harness umbrella. So our previous CD tool was consuming 15 to 20 hours of developer time a week just to keep the lights on. So I now have a small team where I'm dedicating half an engineer's week to doing nothing but managing one tool within this large suite of applications that we have to manage, in addition to creating new core functionality for the Astra project that we were moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. If we wanted to bring on new features for our deployment pipeline, we were talking about weeks worth of effort. And those weeks worth of effort was outside just keeping the lights on. So now I'm dedicating 2.5 to 3.5 engineer weeks every week not only to keep the lights on, but add new features that we needed. And there were core features that should make sense. So after dealing with this for a little while, it became very clear that we needed to start looking for something else, and that open source in this case was not going to be sufficient for us because it wasn't our core function. Our core function in the open source Cassandra world was bringing a database as a service of Cassandra to the world. We couldn't do that and maintain a CD pipeline. So in addition to this, as I alluded to several times now, we had other teams, and these other teams had to come on, and they were taking time because we didn't have the templating that we needed to bring them on. So now you can kind of get a picture of where we were at when we started this journey of building our relationship with Harness. We were kind of in a really bad spot. We had a great process, but our process was limited by the tools and the time it took to spend on that single tool within our application space. Now, let me give you a quick example of what our pipeline looked like and why it was important in any vendor selection that we didn't have to change this. Because quite frankly, there's nothing here special. But many of the vendors out there had very special additions that we would have had to add to this. So we're building on a containerized infrastructure. That's pretty common today. In addition, we use monorepos with multiple Docker files. Again, a very common pattern. Now, I do want to note what we have is mostly monorepos. We do have some repositories that are single application based, and Harness works just fine for those as well. But for us, most of our stuff is monorepo, and they tend to be the hardest anyway in dealing with the CI/CD pipeline. We had internal services being defined. Pretty straightforward. If you've ever worked with any kind of containerized infrastructure, you're going to have some sort of a config file that you're going to deploy those services to your platform. So we had an internal definition of those services within the actual monorepo in order to make our lives easier. Everyone followed a standard schema as well as a standard naming convention. We used Jenkins to do all of our builds. So they ran the Docker files and created the images. We also had Docker files specific to unit testing, so we could run parallel operations in Jenkins. Again, nothing too outlandish with what we're doing. Now, one thing that may be a little bit different in our pipeline is we actually build integration tests as first-class artifacts within our monorepo. So if we deploy service X, we deploy service X integration test right next to it. And we leverage the fact that we can run jobs within our containerized infrastructure to efficiently integration test each and every component that we build. So as our pipelines go forward, any failure in integration tests should cause the entire pipeline to fail. And because integration tests are always deployed with the artifacts themselves, we're guaranteed to always get solid integration test runs. We use Helm for our deployments only because it's a standard way of managing deployments, which means that we build Helm charts from that internal service definition that I talked about earlier. Now, that's something very custom to us, but it allows us to manage very consistent terminology and structure of our deployments for all of our applications. And it gives me a very clear way to inject common environment variables or user-specific environment variables based on what I'm building. Through this pattern, I can actually tell an integration test, for instance, which artifact it's running against and have that be consistent across the board. I can ensure the dependency versions are the same. There's a lot of reasons we do this, but Helm really gives us the standardization. So our process takes the internal service definition and builds the Helm charts instead of us checking Helm charts into our actual repo. Now, we do run acceptance tests, and these are web-based tests of our entire application space. And we use Jenkins just because of its simplicity to do this. So Jenkins runs the Docker file build commands. Jenkins also runs acceptance tests. And we use the combination of those acceptance tests as well as the integration tests that I previously mentioned in order to move an artifact from dev to test to prod. So we went through our discovery conversation and we landed on a couple tools. And one of those tools was Harness. And the promise of Harness for us was we didn't have to change any of our process. And when I say we didn't have to change any of our process, there's one little thing that we did tweak, and I'm going to talk about that. But for the most part, absolutely none of our actual process had to change. Now, when you're moving as fast as we were moving, and you're limited by headcount, like we all are at all times, and it's such a small part of your team's capacity to manage this, not changing things, not having to go reinvent the wheel of what we had already done, and for the most part was consistent and working, that was a big deal. So in order for us to use Harness in our pipeline, we only had to do a few things. We had to set up a repository because we were using Git sync with Harness. That took all of about 10 minutes. We had to install the delegates. Now we have a process by which we install things into production environments. This took a little bit of time, and most of that time was spent on our own internal process to ensure that we are maintaining some level of compliance. We also have compliance from our security organization about SAML integration. So we had to integrate Harness with our SAML provider. Didn't take us very long, but it was work that we had to do. We had to make one slight change to the way that we did home charts deployments. So we didn't change the way we built them, but because our old tool was so rigid in the way that it wanted home charts to actually be provisioned and then consumed, we had to go back to a much more normal way. So we made that change to make our home chart deployment more in line with the way that Harness does it. And quite frankly, it was more in line with the way that we felt it should be managed anyway. And now we have a very repeatable pattern. So that was the one change to our overall process. And for us, it was a change in the right direction because it's the way we wanted to go. Now, we did spend some significant time, and a lot of which was done with Harness's help, on scripting and templating our entire pipeline. Because we manage all of the onboarding for every team onto the platform, we have very solid requirements on what a pipeline must do and what testing must be done. As such, what that told us was we can template our entire pipeline process for all of our environments and make it repeatable because everyone had to adhere to our core set. Now, of course, at any point in time, someone could add to it, and we have a pattern for that. But as far as base onboarding, it's all templatized, which means that now to onboard a new application, and this is one of our big time savings that we came up with, is a matter of running a script that executes the template. That's a big deal when you're trying to manage teams, remembering that it's a very small part of what your team is responsible for. And we had to integrate with Jenkins. Well, we'd already integrated our old tool with Jenkins, so this was relatively easy. The kicker here was our old tool took us like 2.5 to 3 weeks to actually get all the integration correct. Harness took us all of about 5 minutes. So though this was work that we had to do, it didn't take us any time. And injecting in values for our acceptance tests, because we control which set of acceptance tests run in which environment through job parameters, that was extremely easy in Harness to also configure because the integration is very straightforward. The first application that we chose to make into our Harness pipeline is a heartbeat app that we run. This heartbeat app is the tool that we use to determine the health of our CI/CD pipeline. We actually constantly make changes to the app, deploy that app, and then make sure that those changes display in the app. Pretty straightforward process, but it allows us to test our entire process from building to deployment of the build artifacts to the deployment of the artifact itself, to the pipeline process, and everything in between. So this is really the great first place for us to start. And let me just step off for a moment and say, if you are managing a CI/CD pipeline for your company or your team, and you haven't figured out a way to do basic heartbeat acceptance to determine the health of your deployment process, I would highly suggest you take the time to do it. This has not only saved us when things break by telling us before our users find out, but it also has given us a very quick way to know the overall health of not only our CI/CD process, but also our system as a whole, because the heartbeat itself is deploying to the platform. So if heartbeat is running and heartbeat is deploying, we know that CI/CD was working. We also have a pretty good idea that at least the basic routing of our platform is working. and the platform itself is working. So there's a lot of reasons to have this sort of internal heartbeat app, and it can be relatively simple. Anything that you can do that you can look for a change and confirm that that change occurred. So once we were at that point, we rolled it out everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. All of our apps, a lot of our tools that we actually use, everything we rolled out with Harness. Now here's the beauty of this. At the time we did the rollout, we were the fastest team to completely onboard everything we did with Harness. And we didn't do that much work. Because we had everything in line for us to just make this happen, and we had such a good relationship that we started to build with Harness, a relationship that has continued to this day, we were actually able to do all of our work in about a sprint. I think it took us realistically about 14 days, so 10 days and a few extra outside of the sprint, to completely move our entire app space to Harness. Now, if you go back to what I told you about the problem statement, that would have been about the time it would have taken us to maybe add one new feature to our deployment process. This was onboarding and shifting the entire thing. That's a powerful statement to how easy the tool is to use and the fact that it follows very standard deployment problems. Because quite frankly, what do you do in CI/CD? You build, you deploy, you check that your deployment's healthy, you move it past a gate to the next environment, rinse, repeat until you get to prod. It's not really that hard of a thing, but what we were finding was there was so much cruft with other stuff, Harness just worked for us. So again, it took us only a couple of weeks, and this is a powerful testament, again, to Harness itself. We had support from day one walking through this, even when we were POCing this tool, and that support didn't end when we signed the contract, and that support didn't end throughout the first year or even after we went for renewal, because we consistently are getting this. Every new thing we want to try, we have support built in, because that's the way that they operate, which is how the way the tool operates. Again, this is just testament to the power of the platform and the power of the people around the platform, which makes me so excited to be here to talk about it. So I want to talk real quick about how Harness actually helped us. I talked a little bit about this, but I want to talk about the numbers, because many people making these decisions care about the return on investment anytime you're going to go buy a tool. So 0 changes to our process. And the caveat was that one little change, but 0 change to our process. So all of the work we did was simply lifting and shifting. It was not about rebuilding things. And that's very important for us. Again, the minor changes to the implementation. Stability is no longer an issue. Now, I'm going to caveat that. Of course, it's a tool. Every tool has its flaws. There is no silver bullet. But instead of spending half an engineer a week maintaining stability of the platform, I may be spending half an engineer day, a month or two, and most of that issues have been self-inflicted. So for us, stability is no longer a consideration, and the health of our deployment process comes up every week in our ops review, where we review all of our metrics, that once again, there were no build issues, there were no deployment issues. That's a common thing that we run into. One of the big things that we were going to have to build, which was multiple weeks of development, was audit logging for compliance of deployments. We got that for free. So right out of the gate, I immediately have some return on my initial investment, because I don't have to go build audit logging. It just works. It's there. I can see which Git hash actually caused which deployment, when it was deployed, who clicked any manual gates that may be involved. It's there. Our compliance team can just look at it. That's a simple, easy win for us, and something that I expect any and all deployment tools to have, because quite frankly, we all have to track getting things to prod. But this was a big deal because our existing tool did not have a good pattern for it out of the box. We had to go build stuff around it, and knowing what I've now told you about how painful that building was, that was a risk. Allowing templating of pipelines. This easier onboarding took us about a month and a half to 2 months to actually reveal. But once we hit it, it was very clear that this was the right decision. We could have applied it to how fast we got Harness onboarded for all of our existing apps. but you really can't tell until you have a brand new app coming onto the platform, and then we're going to go onboard it. We took that process that took days and turned it into minutes with the fact that we had templated our pipelines. This easier onboarding immediately started saving money. The big picture win also is future work is easier to plan. When we started talking about canary deploys, when we started talking about some of the other things that I want to share with you that we're planning on adding to the platform, it's now real easy for us to look at it and say, this is how long it will take us, not we think. It's really now a matter of we know. So Harness has saved us its cost just in support work, but we're starting to receive more value for our investment because we can add new features and add them very quickly. So let me end this by talking about where we want to go with Harness outside of just standard CD processes. So the first one, and I call this Harness the Harness, is we want to take Harness's pipeline execution engine and actually use it to execute our own onboarding process. So because we've got it all scripted and we have it sort of this pattern defined, and we've been working with our rep, we believe we have a way to use Git to actually onboard new apps by just updating Git and have Harness itself onboard the app for us. Now, again, this may not seem like a big deal, but when now we can take something that is, minutes of work and turn it into no work, and I can start repeating that pattern over and over as our platform gets bigger, it's a big deal. Plus, it also gives us another way to use the tool, because now I've proven that I can do more scripting and more execution within our control plane by using Harness. It gives me a much safer path because now I've got audit logging built in. We'd also like to see about using Harness as a DR tool, and it's something I think we can very easily accomplish because we use Helm charts to deploy our entire infrastructure. If we're in a DR scenario, or if we want to go just rebuild an environment for specific testing of a core component, it would be really nice to be able to spin up a new cluster, have Harness installed on that cluster, and then just do a DR type recovery to rebuild prod, or give me a new test environment, or give me a new dev environment, whatever it may be, just at the click of a button. Instead of me having to manually go execute scripts and run things, this gives me a very, very fast execution path to get this done. We'd also like to have a little bit more visibility, and this is something that Harness provides that we need to integrate with. So we would like to know when deployments happen on our metrics dashboards. And we want to actually see the churn that happens on a deployment as part of our metrics experience. So we drive all of our operations off of metrics. And in doing so, it gives us a very clear way to know, oh, well, we had a spike in database connections, or we had a spike in request volume, or even failures if that may happen. But being able to point to it being deployment-based makes the investigations a little bit different, because now you know even more fine-grained where to work and where to test and where to look. In addition, we can also start leveraging these metrics to improve our own integration tests that run within the platform. So these are sort of pie in the sky, somewhat reality-based visions that we have. But one of the big things that we want to do is canary deploys and or blue-green, depending on the team. And Harness gives us the promise of making this a very simple conversation. Now, you can see why this visibility into our metrics becomes critical, because most of your deployments are going to be based off metrics. So if I can now start doing things where I'm learning the patterns that cause failures during deployments, and now start running integration tests for them, and then start leveraging that to make canary or blue-green deployments that much more efficient, we now have a very clear pattern. And I think within the next 4 to 6 months, we're going to be in a good spot to go not only get that implemented, but make it a showcase of what we can do for other teams within our company that want to come onto the platform. And of course, Harness is always rolling out new features. And because of our relationship, we've seen some of them. And of course, I'll let them tell you all about them. But some of the new features that we've seen really excite us, because it builds in some of our inherent dependencies that we have right now on our platform, within Harness itself. And of course, anytime you can make a central tool valuable and then add more bells and whistles, it just makes it that much more valuable. So there's a lot of excitement that I have with Harness and with our relationship. And it stems from the fact that both of us come from a similar case of admit your mistakes, build on your mistakes, continue to push the relationship forward, and execute with thoughtful ambition of getting the job done. And I think that this relationship has nothing more than to make my life easier, but also to give us a chance to grow both of our companies while we're both doing really, really inherent work. So I do want to thank you for your time here today. I left my GitHub handle and my Twitter handle back on the first page. It's FP Moles. I would love to be engaged in a conversation with you, either from this conference or outside this conference. Anything you want to pick my mind about. I love talking tech. I love talking about courses that I've done. I love talking about mistakes I've made. I love talking about mistakes I've made, and I've made lots of them. I mean, let's be honest, we all do all the time. But that's how we learn, and I love sharing that type of information. So please feel free to connect with me. Let me know if you have anything about CI/CD that you want to talk about that maybe I can help give you a little insight into what I've done wrong and what I've done right. Thanks for your time today.